Not all cars are fit for Turo. In fact, I would go as far as to say that some cars are just flat out bad investments. And so in this video, I'm going to be breaking down cars that I hate for Turo. But keep in mind that these are all my personal opinion, and I'm not only going to be talking about what cars I hate for Turo, why I hate them, but I'm also going to be talking about a few exceptions to these vehicles as well, and in some instances where these cars actually might make sense. So let's get started. Now, I want to preface all of this by saying that this video is under the assumption that you're somebody who's starting a Turo car sharing fleet with the idea of making a semi-passive income stream and getting the highest ROI as possible. If you're someone who wants to be on Turo very casually, maybe you have a personal car that you want to list on Turo to offset or justify those monthly payments, then what I'm talking about in this video probably won't apply to you. This video is specifically targeted towards those people that want to start a side hustle or a business using vehicles that they have no personal agenda with, not those that want to buy a car, rent it out on Turo for fun, and don't really care about optimizing the highest ROI as possible. And so with that in mind, the first one on this list is manual cars. I don't care if your car is a 2009 Mazda with a manual transmission or a high-end sports car with a manual transmission. I hate manual transmission cars for Turo, and there are a few reasons why. First and foremost, it limits your pool of renters. The name of the Turo game is broad audience and broad appeal, and that's why I rent out normal everyday cars. Whenever you rent out a manual transmission car on Turo, not only are you having to look for somebody who's looking for that make, model, vehicle price that you offer with your vehicle, but you also need to add a second layer to that and find the person who's looking for that type of car, but also is looking for the manual variant of that car. And that person also has to feel confident and know how to drive a manual transmission vehicle. And that kind of comes into the second reason why I hate manual cars for Turo, and that's damage. The damage associated with the manual transmission can be very severe if the person driving the car doesn't know how to shift properly. And the thing about Turo is there's really no way to verify that the person who's renting your car actually knows how to drive a manual. And there's even a high likelihood that somebody who's renting your car could be renting it for the sole purpose of learning how to drive a stick, which obviously isn't a good situation either. The fact is, it's going to be very difficult to pin specific damage on a specific guest, and abuse is going to be virtually impossible to prove, and thus it's going to be very hard to be reimbursed for. Unless, of course, you're somebody who's going to be digging into your car and looking at your clutch between each and every rental, but obviously that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The downside of a manual car is just so significantly larger than the downside of an automatic one, and I'm all about limiting downside. Next up is very seasonal cars, and this will depend on where you live and what your market's like. For example, in Dallas, I don't like convertibles for Turo. The whole appeal of a convertible is to drive with the top down, but in Dallas, it's too hot 4 months out of the year, and it's too cold 2 to 3 months out of the year, which means that you can really only enjoy this feature during the fall and the spring. Which means that unless you have a very cheap car that people would be inclined to rent all year round, they would probably just be more inclined to rent either a coupe or sedan during these months where it's too hot or too cold to drive a convertible, thus once again limiting your pool of rentals. Now obviously there's a huge caveat with this point, which is depending on where you live, these types of cars can make a lot of sense. For example, if you live in California, Florida, Hawaii, getting a convertible makes sense. But if you were to live in, say, Denver, where it's cold 6 months out of the year, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Another example would be things like a Polaris Slingshot. These cars are, in my opinion, simply too weather dependent. Remember that the name of the game with Turo not only comes to broad appeal, like I mentioned earlier, but it also comes down to consistent rentals. You want to be able to consistently have people book your cars, and you don't want to have those vehicles be very weather dependent. Have cars that will be in demand and will be rented regardless of the season, and ones that fall in line with the climate of your market. And of course, that will vary a bit from market to market. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you understand what your market needs and you get vehicles that match that. Next on this list is brand new, very average vehicles. What I'm talking about here is either 2023 or 2024 models, Kias, Hyundais, Mazdas, things like that. These cars that, while new, aren't really highly sought after new cars. There's validity behind the business model of getting brand new hot cars and renting out those new cars for a premium on Turo. For example, the Toyota Land Cruiser or the Cybertruck will be extremely hot cars once they're released. And historically, examples like the Rivian, C8 Corvette, or even the Bronco have been great cars for Turo in the beginning. There is something to buying a new hot car that people are excited about, listing that car on Turo and making a lot of money because you're able to charge a premium daily rate. But not all cars fit this bill. In fact, most don't. Let's look at a market like Raleigh, North Carolina, and let's look at some of the 2023 and 2024 model cars. We have a bunch of Kias, Toyotas, a bit of everything. Like, look at this Kia Forte, for example. Don't get me wrong, this is a sharp car, but the math in most cases doesn't make sense with these types of cars. Because this Kia Forte has an MSRP of about $20,000. That's if it's a base model. And in this Raleigh market, this car can probably be rented for between $45 and $55 per day. But if we look at this same market market for cars that are slightly older, you can see that older Kias that are not terribly old, but are maybe a 2015 instead of a 2023 model, are still renting for the mid-40s per day. And you can buy a 2015 Kia with 90,000 miles for under 10 grand. The point is, when you buy a car, keep in mind the purchase price to daily rate ratio. And you want to make sure that ratio makes sense. If you spend $20,000 on a car and you can rent that car out for say $50 per day, but you could alternatively buy a slightly older car for half the price that only rents for between 10 and 15% less per day, then it probably makes mathematic sense to buy that older car that, while older, really isn't going to make much less than the newer, much more expensive one. And the added benefit of going with this older car is, of course, the fact that you no longer have to deal with as much depreciation, which is a huge benefit in and of itself. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this rule. For example, extremely high perceived value cars, or alternatively cars that are really hot and in demand. But for the most part, I'm just not a big fan of buying new cars for Turo for a variety of different reasons. The purchase price to daily rate ratio being one of the biggest ones. Next up are exotic cars. I hate exotic cars for Turo. So much. There is no doubt a business with exotic car rentals, but I don't believe that the avenue for that business is through Turo. And don't get me wrong, I understand the appeal of this. I really understand why people would think to themselves, hey, I'm going to buy an Audi R8 or a Lamborghini or a Maserati or whatever the case is, and I'm going to list this car on Turo in order to justify this payment, and thus I'm going to be able to own this car for free. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally understand where this thought process comes into play, and I would be lying if I haven't thought about doing this myself. The idea of buying something like an Audi R8, listing it on Turo, and being able to own that car for completely free, or in even some more extreme cases, something like a Lamborghini or Ferrari. But I've learned over the years from having over 4,500 trips on Turo and being a Turo host since 2017 that rather than listing an exotic car on Turo to justify that purchase, my philosophy is don't rent out nice cars to justify getting a nice car for yourself. Instead, rent out normal everyday cars and use the cash flow from those vehicles to buy yourself a nice car. In my opinion, I think the downside of an exotic or even ultra high-end luxury car is just so high with Turo. Because number one, you limit your pool of renters exponentially because of the fact that there are age requirements for these nicer vehicles, either 25 or 30 years old, depending on the specific value and type of car. Number two is the ROI on these vehicles are just significantly worse. I did a video breakdown on the ROI of an exotic car versus the ROI of a cash car about 6 months ago. And in that video, I broke down the fact that for most people, renting out an exotic car from an ROI perspective just doesn't make sense. I'll link that video down in the description below for anybody that wants to check that out. And number three, the liability with these cars is just also significantly larger, and you have to pay more attention to the vehicle to prevent things like excessive wear and tear, to help avoid depreciation, and of course, very costly damage claims. I talked about this on my channel many times before, but I used to own a Maserati Ghibli that I had rented out on Turo for 6 months before it was totaled. And while I know that a Maserati Ghibli is absolutely not an exotic car, it's sort of on the lowest point of the totem pole whenever it comes to these ultra high-end luxury vehicles, because Maserati and Ferrari are very close together, so if somebody can't afford a Ferrari, they sometimes will go to a Maserati instead. A Maserati is, in my opinion, one of the highest perceived value cars for the cost, and as a result, people really like these vehicles and they like to go fast in them. And while I personally loved the Maserati Ghibli, this car was simply abused far too often on Turo to justify us ever getting another one. The car was totaled whenever a guest was speeding and hit a wall on the highway. Fortunately, the guest was fine. But a few rentals prior to whenever the vehicle was totaled, a different renter actually went 156 miles per hour in this car, and it was the first time ever where HP and I actually had to call up the guest and tell them that they had to slow down or else we would be getting police involved. And as far as high-end luxury and exotic car goes, Maserati is like barely touching how fast and how luxurious these vehicles can actually be. So I can't even imagine the liability and the risk that would come along with renting something like an Audi R8 or a Lamborghini that is just that much above a Maserati. These cars require more work, they depreciate faster, they have a smaller audience, the downside is just much larger. I personally would never buy an exotic car to rent out that car on Turo, and I would never encourage a new host to do it either. Again, like anything, there are exceptions to this rule, and I would say probably the one exception to the no exotic cars on Turo rule would be if you're a Turo host that already has a bunch of other cars, and you can kind of use the rest of your fleet to offset some of the risk of this one exotic car. But truthfully, if you fall into that category, you're probably not watching this video. But there you guys have it, some of the cars that I hate for Turo. Now, at the end of the day, there are a lot of cars that work for Turo, and there's a lot that don't. And I think the cars that I've discussed today are simply cars that I think are oftentimes attractive to newer Turo hosts, but oftentimes are ones that simply shouldn't be messed with, especially at the beginning. Again, these are all just my personal opinions, and they really go hand in hand with the business model that I talk about here on YouTube, which is the idea of renting out cars that are cheap, low risk, and appeal to a broad audience. Like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.